how do we typically metabolize histamine? Because obviously not everybody has this issue. And so how does it start to build up in our system?
Yeah, so, I'd like to think of this analogy like a bucket analogy. So, when you
Mhm.
think of your body, let's picture your body as a bucket, and you have all of these things that are pouring into the bucket, over and over again. And then you have holes in the bucket. So, as long as those holes are, as long as we're draining, we're filling up, we're draining, we're filling up, we're draining, we're fine. And we can tolerate histamine. It's not an issue. But we have two different things that dysregulate it. So, we either get, let's say, clogs, which we'll talk about how we break down in the bottom of the bucket. So, we can't drain, or we get too much histamine coming in, or a combination of both we see a lot of times. And that's when we start to see all of these effects, and they're really affecting people. So the way we break down histamine in our body are from two different pathways. We have one that's our primary pathway and it's actually in our gut. So it's broken down by diamine oxidase. That's the main enzyme responsible for breaking down histamine in our intestinal tract. And it can become compromised from several reasons. We can see genetic variants. So some people are just born with a genetic variability and, have a SNP with the DAO enzyme. So that can lead to just a natural predisposition to a lower enzyme function. But, we'll talk a little bit later about you don't usually see these things coming on right from birth. So it's usually kind of this combination of factors. What we often see, one of the biggest things is an imbalance in gut bacteria. And when that starts to happen, that can impact the production of the DAO, because the DAO is produced in the lining of our intestines. So we start to see this compromised enzyme function. We also need certain nutrients to actually make DAO. So we need things like B6, copper, vitamin C for optimal activities. And then we also can start some of the dietary factors when we're just eating a lot, an overload of these histamine rich foods, which we can get into, start to just overwhelm that enzyme and we can't break it down. We also see medications. So certain medications like NSAIDs, some antidepressants, some immune modulators can actually affect this enzyme. And then we actually also see hormones. So estrogen can actually lower DO activity also. And actually progesterone helps it. So when we start to see this high estrogen, low progesterone, this hormone balance where we start to see estrogen
Mm.
dominance, that can be another place where we start to see this imbalance in that enzyme and
Yeah. And
start
that's
to see
important for
things.
women because
Mhm.
we know when women are under a lot of stress, that's going to lower their progesterone, particularly their progesterone release. So chronic stress can play a role, can tie into that.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of people they're not thinking about histamine. We think about, okay, my hormones are out of balance and I have
Yeah.
migraines and I'm anxious all the time and I have all these symptoms. And sometimes we need to, trace it back to,
Mm.
okay, yes, they're all happening. What's connecting them? And sometimes once it's like connecting, like we do, connecting all the dots is where we start to get these answers. And this can be a string and sometimes connecting a lot of those things.
Yeah, and it affects so many different conditions in the body. Like you were talking about migraines, mood issues, digestive issues, skin issues, a lot of people dealing with skin issues, even like sun sensitivities. There's some people that are like, yeah, I'm allergic to the sun. I remember,
Mhm.
years ago somebody told me that and I'm like, how can somebody be allergic? I mean, I understand getting sunburnt, but how can you be allergic? Like you go
Right.
out in the sun and all of a sudden he gets rashes
Mhm.
and, hives on his skin, right?
Yeah.
And
I
this
had
has to
that
do with histamine.
recently. I
Yeah.
had someone recently who was like, for 20 years, every time he went out, he's like, I can't go to the beach. And he's like, I can't be in the sun. And we just did some gut healing work. We did some, the immune modulating. And within 3 weeks, he's like, I don't have this anymore. And it would be heat and sun. And so it
Yeah.
was like working out or going to the beach no other time. So it's really, yeah, it's hard. It's a lot of times it's hard to pinpoint some of these issues because
Yeah.
they're so broad.
Yeah, and all that's a sign that the immune system is so imbalanced and dysfunctional and fragile. And so
Hmm.
the body can't handle, basically getting in the sun, even though it's obviously extraordinarily healthy, it's a stressor, it's a mild stressor, hormetic stressor, kind of like exercise or anything like that. And that could push somebody like that individual, and the individual I talked with, or it just pushes them over their limit, overloads their system, and they have some sort of symptoms that are related with that.
Yes, yeah. And another way we break down the histamine is actually we see a lot of people with the MTHFR genetic variant
Mm,
too, and that's becoming more known, more common. So
yeah.
histamine and methyltransferase is another way we break down histamine in our cells. So sometimes when you have a genetic variant there, you can also have some issues breaking down the histamine. Like we also see you need CME, and you
Mm.
actually need again like B6, B12, folate. So it's getting all of those nutrients too that can be really important for the breakdown.
Yeah, super key. And so you mentioned gut dysbiosis. Are there certain gut bacteria that produce more histamine? I believe Klebsiella would be one of them. Are you familiar with some of the others?
Yeah, so we have more. So actually, and this is what gets tricky because
Yeah.
we have, a lot of things that we do for gut healing are wonderful. We need to heal the gut, but we need to do it in a way that works with histamine because
Yeah.
even some strains of lactobacillus can be histamine producing. So you
Mm,
have to be really careful with probiotics, even because, fermented foods are high in histamine. We see some lactobacillus. So we see things like lactobacillus, Morganella, Pseudomonas, Citrobacter, Klebsiella, Enterobacter, those are a Proteus, those are all histamine producing
mm.
bacteria. So we always talk about how our microbiome is, what's controlling us. Are we controlling our microbiome, or does it control us? And sometimes even if you don't have the enzyme deficiency, if you're not eating high histamine, if you don't have these other insults on your body, if you're producing if you have this bacteria and you have it in high levels, it can be producing histamine without any of the other things that you're doing. And that's a really important factor because I don't know that everyone's really paying attention to this factor when they're having these symptoms and they're working on gut health.
That's so important because a lot of this standard advice for healing gut issues, right? Using bone broth, apple cider vinegar, fermented foods, a lot of these things that have helped many individuals are not going to work for somebody that has histamine intolerance or mast cell activation syndrome. They're going to say, you know what? In fact, there are people out there that will say, I actually feel better when I eat like when I eat
Mhm.
healthy, I feel worse, right? When I eat
Yes.
unhealthy, I feel better. And so a
Mhm.
lot of times that can be related to perhaps, FODMAP issues can sometimes be the issue. Like they're eating a lot of broccoli and stuff like that, and they're getting more bloating. And then also histamine issues where when they consume a lot of these, foods that many health influencers, including myself, have promoted, they feel worse because it's overloading their histamine system. And let's talk about some of those higher histamine foods.
Yeah, so we're going to look at, that big one that we're talking about with gut health that is, everyone's talking about are fermented foods. So we really have to watch fermented food. So we're going to actually, there are different things. So there's foods that are high in histamine, there's foods that liberate histamine, and then
Mm,
there's foods that limit DAO. So it gets
yeah.
confusing because, when I'm working with people and I'm giving them these lists, it's explaining, okay, these all have different effects. So when we're talking about high histamine foods, we're talking about things like aged cheeses, fermented foods, cured meats, alcohol. So, that's why if you have a glass of wine, you can say, okay, a lot of these symptoms, I had
Mm,
alcohol the night before, that can be a histamine trigger. Then
mm,
we have some of the histamine liberating foods, and these are a little bit more tricky. So we have things like strawberries, tomatoes, bananas. So those are things that you're thinking, okay, those are healthy. I'm not maybe expecting those foods to be in there. And then we can even have like tea is something that can inhibit and limit the DAO enzyme. So we have to really look. The other actually, there's two other things. One of the other things is that you also have to be really careful of leftovers. And I think that that's another tricky thing when you're someone, especially who meal preps, because histamine can grow in foods. So if you're cooking, even if you're eating something, let's say you're cooking chicken, it's fresh, it's a lower histamine food, but you're letting it sit in the refrigerator, meal prepping for the week and you're letting it sit in the refrigerator for 3-4 days, you could still be getting histamine from foods that actually aren't high in histamine. So you have to be careful. I always recommend if you're someone who really, meal prepping can be essential for some people just for their schedules. So if you're doing that, flash freeze your food. So cook it, freeze it right away to limit that histamine growth,
mm.
because that's something that I think can be difficult to really look at.
Yeah, the longer it sits out, even if it's in the refrigerator, the more histamine it's accumulating. So
Mhm.
yeah, super key. So that's a great tip. And there's lists of different types of foods. And Most of them are healthier foods, right? They tend to be healthier, nutrient dense foods. So it makes it harder. What are some of the key foods that people can be focusing on if they are dealing with histamine intolerance, mast cell activation syndrome? What are some of the lower histamine foods? You mentioned chicken.
Yeah, chicken. You want to make sure, like, when you're getting your meat, that you're getting it, the freshness.
Mm.
So that can be, if you can get it from a butcher that's close to you, that that it's more fresh, that can be, something that's good. We can look at things like blueberries, apples, pears, mangoes. Those are all things. Most vegetables are safe. So most of the vegetables, we want to be careful of sometimes the tomatoes, the nightshades, the olives, pickles, sauerkraut. Those would be the avoids. But other than that, you're pretty safe on vegetables. You can think of rice, quinoa, things like that can be good go to. You can go to extra virgin olive oil for cooking. We have ghee is something that most people can tolerate. So we're looking, and you also want to keeping a log and a journal can be helpful. So because for example, you might, and not everybody responds to every food, so it is an individual thing, where some people I'm working with say, okay, you know what, bananas don't seem to bother me, but I can't eat avocados, let's say, or there, which really can be individual. So really looking at your foods and doing it more in a discovery. I want to point out that I feel like the low histamine diet isn't the end all be all for long term. So because as we're saying,
Short
there's a
term.
lot
Yeah.
of nutrient dense foods on there, but it's an investigative piece when you're saying, okay, do these foods bother me? Really pinpointing those foods while you're working on the gut health, while you're doing the other things
Mm.
to reduce your load, and then hopefully you can tolerate more things.